right. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants event. My name is Joe Grabowski, and I'll be your host for today. So for those who might be tuning in via YouTube right now and maybe didn't get the message from first thing this morning, we had a little change in plans today. We're planning on connecting with Paul Salopek on his Out of Eden walk from China, but I received an email late last night. There's a lot going on in China right now with new government meetings to form their new government. There's zero lockdowns going on in a lot of the cities. And Paul actually had to leave the area he was in to make sure that he wasn't going to be locked down for an extended period of time. So that means we're not going to be able to connect with Paul today. We are going to reschedule an event for maybe 2 weeks or so from now when things die down a little bit. And then I'll message all the classrooms and make sure you know when the new event is happening. So the plan for today, because I know it's early in the morning and the start of the day for a lot of classrooms, is we're still going to have an event together today. I'm going to host a little event about the Galapagos. So I was lucky enough in August to be in the Galapagos, and I have some great pictures, some great video clips to take you into these amazing islands and share that story. So after maybe 20 minutes or so of that, we'll switch gears and do a little Q&A action together. And then we'll wrap things up. So my name, as I said before, it's Joe. I am the founder of Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. I'm an explorer with the National Geographic Society. And yeah, well, I'm going to share this expedition with you. I've actually been lucky enough to be to the Galapagos twice. And the Galapagos is one of the most incredible places on the island or in the world, this amazing group of volcanic islands. And I'm going to share my screen and we'll take you there right now. So just bear with me for a moment, and that should be there. And I'm just going to take myself away so we have a nice full screen view there. Okay. So Galapagos. Here is South America. The Galapagos is part of the country of Ecuador. So here's our map of South America. Ecuador is here on the Pacific coast. And then about 1,000 miles or kilometers off the shore is this group called the Galapagos. And you can see this is the equator here. And the equator passes right through the Galapagos. And if we go to the next slide here, we've got a closer look at the Galapagos. These are the islands in the Galapagos. And I mentioned that they're volcanically created. They're volcanic islands. So right here, somewhere in this area, is a hot spot on the ocean floor. And so that hot spot is basically a vent where magma, where lava, liquid rock can come up to the seafloor. When it hits the ocean water, it cools down. And over thousands, tens of thousands of years, that builds up more and more and more until eventually that new rock, that new land pokes out from the surface of the ocean, forming these new islands. So here's the hot spot. These are the youngest islands right here, Fernandina and Isabella, and they still have active volcanoes on them. In fact, Wolf volcano erupted not too long ago. And so they're the young islands. And then as you move to the east, the islands get older and they're not volcanically active anymore. And they start to wear down with erosion. So the rock breaks down and the islands get smaller and shorter. They're not as tall as they used to be. So these are the oldest islands. Espanola is down here. This is San Cristobal. And then if you could follow all the way kind of going towards the coast again of South America, you would find seamounts just below the surface. And these are old islands of the Galapagos that were formed volcanically. They moved along this conveyor belt and then eroded and wore down until they sunk back beneath the surface. So it's kind of like ghost islands of the Galapagos that had their time in the sun and then they've sunk back below the surface again, which is the fate of these islands in the future. And the conveyor belt will keep moving on over thousands and thousands of years, forming new islands. So to get to the Galapagos, it's pretty far from Canada. I'm just outside of Toronto, so I had to take a few flights. And this is a flight here as we were coming into Panama. And if you know Panama well, I think I included a map. Yeah, okay. So if you know Panama well, Panama is really important because there was a canal right across the country that was dug. And it is where these big, massive container ships can take a shortcut from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. So I'll show you what that looks like here. You can see all of these container ships lined up and waiting for their turn to go through the Panama Canal. And then if we look at the map of the world again here, and we find Panama right here, Panama was basically split in half by this canal that was dug. So that means if I were shipping things, let's say from New York to Hawaii, I could go all the way around, and this is the way it used to be, and then all the way up to Hawaii. But with this canal, now you can sail down to the canal, come through, and it's a huge shortcut, shorter time, less fuel. So the Panama Canal is an easy shortcut for shipping to get between the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean. This is Guayaquil, where we spent a day and a night before we head to the Galapagos. And this was the hotel we stayed at, and this is one of the few kind of remaining original buildings in the city. There was a massive earthquake and fire in the past, and so a lot of the buildings were destroyed, had to be rebuilt. Now, after flying to the Galapagos from Guayaquil in Ecuador, this was my home for 7 days in the Galapagos. So as you can imagine, if you look at that map of the Galapagos, if you want to see the islands, you have to be on a boat. You have to be able to go to different islands to see different parts of the Galapagos. You can't do it by car. You need to be on a ship like this where you can live on board for several days. So this is the National Geographic Islander. And so myself and about 20 other people spent 7 days on this ship as we went through the Galapagos and visited different islands. Now, the Galapagos does an incredible job of protecting the wild places. So about 95% of the land is completely protected national park on the islands. So nobody can go there except for scientists with special permission to do research. And there's only 4 spots that you can live in the Galapagos. One is Porto Ayero, and about 18,000 people live there. And then there's 3 other spots where people can live, but it's much, much smaller, like a couple hundred people in some of the spots. And so the ship, there's nowhere to park the ship. There's no docks. There's no piers. So if you want to visit the islands, to hike or snorkel, you have to take little Zodiacs. So our boat had a whole bunch of these little Zodiacs on board, and all day long, as we went to different islands or different parts of the islands, we would hop in these little Zodiacs and they would take us to shore for something called a wet landing. So they get you as close as they can, and then you jump in and walk the rest of the way onto the island. And so let's take a look at some of these islands. This one here is a pretty cool island called Daphne Major. And you can see it looks very much like an old volcano. It's got the big crater in the middle, high walls. It's very hard to land on this island. Nobody really visits. There's kind of one really important study on finches that goes on this island, but people don't really visit this island because it's really hard to land on. You can kind of see these steep cliffs all the way around here. And then here now we're looking at Santa Cruz. You can see this island looks very different. You can see black volcanic rock here. You can see some plants that have started to grow on the island. Now we're looking at San Cristobal, and you can see another different looking island. Bigger cliffs and bigger kind of rocky mountains. You can see nice beaches here along the shore. And then on the other side of the island is completely different here. Here you've got this blue turquoise water. You've got white sandy beaches, a lot flatter, a little bit of green starting to grow. This is Espanola. This is the oldest island, and this is what they call a blowhole. So as the waves come in, they kind of go into a little cave, and all the pressure shoots the water up there, kind of like a whale's blowhole. And then some islands are covered in these beautiful prickly pear cactuses. So these are food for land iguanas, and we'll see a picture of a land iguana a little further in. And then you can see these little finches here that make their home in amongst these prickly pear cactuses as well. And then again, just looking at these differences here, these big rock walls on this island here. And this one's Floriana, so a little smoother, and then kind of more plant life there. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the animals on the Galapagos and why they're so unique. And so first we should probably talk about how animals got to the Galapagos in the first place, because these islands, when they formed, would have just been rock, empty rock, no plants, nothing. So how do plants and then animals get to something that's like 1,000 kilometers away from South America? Well, birds can fly there, so that's pretty easy. Bats could fly there as well. Seeds can blow in the wind for long periods of time. They can also float over the ocean for long periods of time. So seeds got there through the wind and also drifting on the ocean. And then animals, you're not going to find many natural mammals on the Galapagos other than bats, but reptiles and lizards got there by floating. So big storms in Peru, in Ecuador, would knock down a bunch of trees, a bunch of branches, and that would all float in the ocean like a big island. And then iguanas and tortoises and snakes would also get swept into the ocean. They'd crawl onto these floating islands, and then they drift to the Galapagos. And reptiles, and they can live a long time without food and water, which is why they could make it to the islands. Whereas something like a mouse or a monkey, it couldn't live more than a couple days. So they didn't make it out to the Galapagos if they were floating on those rafts. So you can see we've got a pelican here, and this pelican is just having a nice little fish there. You can see this fish getting its last glimpse of the sky before it goes right down into that pelican's stomach. The Galapagos is amazingly unique because I think when most people think of penguins, they think of Antarctica. They think of the cold. But actually, there's penguins found in warm places all around the southern hemisphere. You can find penguins in Australia and New Zealand. You can find penguins in South Africa. You can find penguins in Brazil and Chile and Argentina. And then the furthest south, right on the equator, you can find these Galapagos penguins. And the reason they can live in the Galapagos is because the waters around the Galapagos are very cold. So on land, it's very warm. It's right on the equator, very sunny, but the waters are very cold and full of nutrients. So if you think of the deep ocean and the currents at the bottom, there's a lot of nutrients being carried in really cold currents along the bottom of the ocean. The Galapagos are kind of like big walls that stick up out from the sea floor. And so when that current hits the islands, it's pushed upwards, and then it comes to the surface and can then be brought in. So very, very cool. And that's why so much life can live around the Galapagos. There's so much nutrients. That cold water lets the penguins live there as well. But they're very endangered. There are not a lot of penguins left in the Galapagos due to a few reasons. Things like climate change, food sources being lost, invasive species eating their eggs. So they're working very hard to protect them in the Galapagos. So it's very lucky, very cool if you get to see some penguins in the Galapagos. This was one of my favorite islands to visit. This island here that I'm on is called Bartolome. And you can see the ship there. And then if you look over here, you can see some of the volcanoes on Santa Cruz. And then you can see this really cool formation called Pinnacle Rock. This used to be a whole volcano, but this is all that's left. It's just this one piece of the wall that all collapsed into the ocean. And then here's another kind of volcanic crater. And right here in the middle is a plug. This is a little plug of rock that kind of hardened as it came to the surface and blocked off where the volcanic stuff was coming out. So you can see here a better view here from the top of this volcano, looking over Bartolome, looking to Santa Cruz, and then looking at this Pinnacle Rock here. And then we spent a lot of the day snorkeling all along this area, which was really, really cool. Now, this is pretty neat. This is Floriana. And this is probably one of the oldest working post offices in the world. So it doesn't look like much, but the people who used to visit the Galapagos in the 1600s, the 1700s, the 1800s were whalers. So a lot of whalers would come through the Galapagos, and they had a barrel where they'd put their mail. And then if another ship was going back home, another whaling ship, maybe to somewhere like Boston in the United States, or maybe to England, they would pick up that mail and deliver it. So it wasn't very fast. It took a very long time, but that's how the whalers would get their letters back home when they were whaling. Sometimes they'd be out there for 3, 4, 5 years. So slow mail, but it worked. And so still to this day, people will come and put postcards and things like that into this bin. And then when people visit the island, you can look through the postcards and find ones that are close to you. And then when you go home, you can hand deliver those. So again, it could take like years for those to make it to where they want to go, but it's kind of a cool old mail system that's still sort of running in the Galapagos. I mentioned our land iguanas, and here's a nice close-up of a land iguana. They like eating green stuff, especially those prickly pear cactuses that I showed you in an earlier photo. These are so cool. I love these birds. These are blue-footed boobies, and they're all over the Galapagos, and I think you can see why they get their name. They have those beautiful blue feet, and those blue feet are really important for the blue-footed booby. So here's a male and a female, and when it's time to nest and hatch young, the males have to show off and impress the females. So the male does this really cool dance, and the whole time he shows off his feet, because the bluer his feet, that means he's really healthy. It means he's eating lots of fish, and the pigments from the fish skin go into his feet. So if you look here, you can see he's showing his feet, and the female's really looking at those feet to try and determine, does she think that those feet are blue enough? He also holds up sticks to show that he can find really cool things for the nest. They do this thing called sky pointing, where they point and call up at the sky. And then, if all goes well, several weeks later, we'll have some chicks, usually 1 or 2 chicks like this. And then they take turns going out to catch fish and then to feed their chicks. So when they catch the fish, they come back and they regurgitate. They barf that fish back up into their young's mouth, just like that. And the amazing thing about the Galapagos is for hundreds of thousands of years, there really hasn't been any predators on the Galapagos. So the animals there aren't afraid of people. They don't think people are dangerous. And they just do their normal things while you're nearby. So you can watch all these things happening from very close, take beautiful pictures, and the animals don't even care that you're there, which is pretty amazing. There's flamingos in the Galapagos, which I thought was pretty cool. You can find them in these little marshes. There's another picture of a couple of them there together, and they're filter feeders. So they put their beaks into that water and they filter out little shrimps and things like that. There are sea lions everywhere. I love watching the sea lions. They're always doing something. So here's a little sea lion pup having some milk from its mom. Here's another one peeking over top of its mom. Here's one just having a float in the water. You can see these amazing whiskers that help them sense things underwater, especially on the bottom, the ocean floor. The rocks are always covered in these beautiful Sally Lightfoot crabs. You can see they have these beautiful colors here. There's hunting birds like this green heron here that's waiting for a fish to swim too close. And then this is the biggest predator in the Galapagos. This is the Galapagos Hawk. And so they'll hunt snakes and baby iguanas, and they're the biggest predator in the Galapagos. Now, there are other predators, but they were brought by humans. So things like cats and dogs that have gotten loose. And so they're bigger predators, but they don't belong there, and they're not natural. They're invasive species. And there's that hawk taken off. The albatross. This is one of the largest birds in the world, the waved albatross. They nest on the island. They mate for life. So once they have a partner, they will lay their egg, raise their young, and then they take off and disappear. They leave each other for sometimes a year or more. Then they come back and find each other on this island. This is Espanola. So you can see a Galapagos gliding there. They can glide without touching land for easily over a year. And there's how they greet each other. They kind of do this bill tapping side by side to greet each other. And then there we go. We've got a little chick here that they'll be taking turns getting food for and feeding this chick. And then there's a Galapagos Mockingbird hanging out too. A little close up there of that chick. The marine iguanas are super cool. So they would have been the same species as the land iguana. They would have been one species, but over a long period of time, they evolved into two different species. One that likes the land, and then the marine iguana is the only lizard that swims and gets its food in the ocean. So they dive down in the ocean. They eat seaweed and algae off the rocks. They can't stay long because they get really cold. They're cold-blooded. So they come back on land and they warm up in the sun like they're doing here. You can see sometimes they're all black. Sometimes they have these beautiful red skin patches, depending on what island you're on. And sometimes they can even get these beautiful blue patches mixed in as well. And I mentioned invasive species are a problem in the Galapagos, and here is an example. So here are some goats. These do not belong in the Galapagos. They were brought by people. You can see they're feeding on the plants. And then you can see how trouble can arise as well. This is a blue-footed booby nest, and you can see how easily it could be trampled by these goats. So they do not belong on the island, but the Galapagos are working really hard to try and remove the invasive species. There's other boobies too. This is a red-footed booby. And then when you look out over the water, sometimes you see really cool things like this humpback whale that was cruising by the shore. And then it started to show off a little bit and started to jump out of the water. So it's amazing that these massive, 40 or more ton animals can just throw their whole body out of the water like this. And scientists don't really know why. Are they doing it for fun? Are they doing it to communicate? So big, loud bangs that can be heard by other whales further away. Are they doing it to get parasites off their skin? We just don't know. But it's pretty cool when they do it. And here's a cool rock. This is Kicker Rock. I think you can see why it gets that name. Looks like a big soccer boot. And we'll wrap up with our giant tortoises. The Galapagos are famous for the giant tortoises. Again, this would have been all one species. They would have drifted to the different islands, but because they drifted to different islands and were separated for hundreds of thousands, even millions of years, they evolved differently to adapt to those islands. Some of them have big, long necks for eating food that's really high up. Some of them have really short necks because they eat food off of the ground. Some have short shells. Some have really high shells. But each island in the Galapagos has its own unique species. Unfortunately, though, due to humans, some of those have gone extinct. So when sailors would visit the island hundreds of years ago, they would like fresh food. And they could take the tortoises back to the ship, turn them upside down, and they could live like that for up to 3 months. And so they would eat the tortoises on their journey. So there's some just hanging out in a nice little mud pond. Here's one with a finch on its back. And so that's what I want to share photo-wise. I'm going to come back here and share my screen one more time because I would like to show you a really cool video of what the underwater world is like in the Galapagos. So just bear with me for 1 second while I make sure I pick the right video, and then we'll check this one out together. All right. I don't see the video here. Maybe I'll share it in a different way. Where did it go? Okay, Galapagos. Oh, okay. I know where it is. All right. We've got it now.
All right, Annalise, do you come ask your question?
How did you find the camouflage animal in the underwater world?
Oh, that's a really good question. Okay, so they do camouflage really well underwater. In fact, I have a couple more from the first time I went to the Galapagos. I'm going to pull those up in the background to show you some other kinds of camouflage underwater. But the way you kind of find something underwater, like that stingray, for instance, it blends in really well to the bottom. But you kind of look for outlines because the outlines are just a little bit off. So the outlines kind of stand out a little bit. And then another way, I want to pull up a picture here. There's a beautiful fish, which actually could be considered the most dangerous fish or the most dangerous creature in the Galapagos. I have in a little video clip here. So I'm going to share this, another example of camouflage here with you in this little video clip. Let me just share my screen one more time. I want a window. Okay, so this is from my first trip to the Galapagos. I'm going to fast forward just a little bit here until I get to this. There we go. So this here is a beautiful example of camouflage. So you can see this fish here. You can barely see it. It almost blends in perfectly. We'll look at that one more time there. Almost blends in perfectly with the rocks. This stonefish. And it is very, very venomous. It has spikes on it that if you touch by accident, you put your hand down in the wrong spot, they're very, very venomous. And the poison in those spikes could be enough to really make you feel pretty awful and possibly even kill a person. So the fish aren't chasing people. They're not trying to poke you with their spikes. It's really a defense. If something tries to eat it, it's going to get poked by those spikes. And if you're not really being careful where you're putting your hands, you really shouldn't touch anything when you're in the water. You might accidentally put your hand on that. But that's another example of some beautiful camouflage. And so usually I look for outlines. You can see outlines that look just a little bit different, a little bit off from what you expect to see. That's a good question. We'll come back to you in a minute, fifth graders. We'll see if you have another question there. We've also got a virtual crew joining us from YRDSB virtual. Grade sixes. I think I see some questions in the chat. So maybe I can just grab that. Or if the teacher wants to pop in, she can ask them as well. But I can also grab them from the chat here. So maybe I'll just do that. So the first one here is the big sharks, like great white sharks. So great white sharks, not really. The waters aren't really the kind of waters that they like. They kind of prefer waters like off the coast of New England, kind of really colder, a little bit murkier waters. They like those waters off of Mexico, off of South Africa are really popular areas. You don't hear much about great white sharks around the Galapagos, but you do have the world's biggest fish, which is a shark. And the world's biggest fish is a whale shark. And so those can be found in the Galapagos. They can get as big as a school bus. So think of a 60-foot school bus and think of a shark that's as big as a school bus. Now, nothing to worry about because they're filter feeders. Even though they're giant sharks, they don't really have any teeth. They have kind of small little plates almost, teeth for grinding a little bit. But they filter feed out of the water. So plankton, zooplankton, tiny fish eggs, things like that, fish larvae, they just kind of suck water in and they filter out what they like from the water. So the world's largest fish is in the Galapagos. Most of the other sharks are about as, like the white tip reef sharks you saw in the video are probably only maybe 3, 4, 5 feet long. Then there's Galapagos sharks and dusky sharks. They can be a little bit bigger. And then the hammerheads, they can be bigger too. They can be over 10 feet, some of the hammerheads. Can I explain why the waters are cold again? Absolutely. So cold water tends to sink. Cold water, there's a giant, if you look at our planet's oceans, there's like a giant conveyor belt of currents, cold, deep currents that run along the bottom of our oceans. And nutrients sink to the bottom of our oceans. And so those cold currents are full of nutrients, and they kind of move around the world very slowly in these deep water currents. Now, when the Galapagos Islands form, there's a hot spot that's kind of pushing rock and molten lava upwards. It hardens, and over thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, eventually that builds up and those islands poke out of the water. Now, when those cold water currents are drifting along the bottom, they hit the islands and they're forced up to the top. That's called upwelling, when they're forced up to the top. And that brings cold water and a ton of nutrients up to the surface. And so that cold water is full of good food, which is why the whale sharks, the sea lions, the penguins, the sea turtles, that's why there's so many there, because there's so much good food there. So it's called upwelling. That cold, deep water hits the islands, right? Because they're kind of up from the rocky bottom, and it's pushed that up to the top. And those nutrients can then be reached by the seabirds and all kinds of other life that love getting in on that action. All right, fifth graders, you have another question there?
In your opinion, what is your favorite animal on the Galapagos?
That's really hard because there's a lot of really cool animals in the Galapagos. And the Galapagos, like a lot of islands, you find things that you find nowhere else in the world. And so we call that endemic. Just a fancy way to say that it's only found in one spot in the world, endemic. And so islands are really unique parts where you can find a lot of species found nowhere else. Because once something gets to an island, then it doesn't mix anymore with plants or animals from, the other place that they came from, whether it's a bigger continent or a different island. And then over long periods of time, they can change. And so you find on islands really unique species that you find nowhere else in the world. And I think the tortoises, were my favorite because they're, whenever you hear about the Galapagos or you hear about Charles Darwin's famous visit to the Galapagos, you hear about the giant tortoises. And certain animals like the giant tortoises, like the finches, like the Galapagos Mockingbirds, they helped him form his theory of evolution, of natural selection. That if there's changes in a plant or an animal, and those little changes help them survive a little bit better, then odds are that they're going to leave more offspring, and those changes will become more prevalent or found more in that population. So when he visited the Galapagos, he noticed there were 4 kinds of mockingbirds, and they were on different islands. He noticed that the finches on different islands had different sized beaks or different colorations. He also noticed the tortoises had different little changes on the different islands, maybe a bigger neck, maybe a shorter neck, maybe longer legs. So visiting those islands really helped him. And the tortoises, they're still really big. But before humans started to hunt and take so many of them, they were even bigger. In fact, you hear some stories, they were so big that Darwin was able to sit on the back of one, and the tortoise was crawling around with him riding on the back of the tortoise. So they were much bigger than they are now, and it was really cool to get to see them that way. Is Darwin Island called... Yeah, so Darwin Island, absolutely. That island further to the north with Wolf and Darwin Island definitely got its name from Darwin. He's definitely the most famous visitor to the Galapagos, I would say. He wrote about it in The Voyage of the Beagle, which is a great story that he wrote. He spent 5 years on a ship. Can you imagine that? In the 1800s, he spent 5 years going around the entire world on a ship, stopping all over the world, in Africa and South America and South Georgia and up in the tropics, Australia, New Zealand. So he did this amazing 5-year journey. And in the Galapagos, he collected a lot of samples. And of course, we know the Galapagos was one of the key spots that he visited that helped him form his theory of evolution. So yeah, absolutely. That island's named after him. And there's a research station on Santa Cruz, the Charles Darwin Research Station, of course, is named after him as well. Okay, online. Paisley was asking about favorite animal, and I think we just talked about the tortoise. And then if it's in the water, it has to be the sea lions. They're so much fun. You saw in the video that one that stole my flipper. It stole my flipper right off my foot and was playing with it, and I had to gently take it back. Another question here from Eshal would like to know if I saw animals I've never seen before. Absolutely. Both times I visited the Galapagos, I saw things I've never seen before because some of them are only found on the Galapagos. So unless you go and visit the Galapagos, odds are you're not going to see them. And then each time I went, I visited some different islands. So I was able to see some different animals each time that maybe I didn't see before. Fifth graders in Barstow, do you want to squeeze one more in? And then I can see one more in the chat from our grade 6s as well.
Okay.
Was the turtle actually red?
Was the turtle actually? Oh, in the video?
Yeah.
I think you were just seeing a funny trick of kind of the light coming through the water. So the turtle would have been more brown. And then that seems kind of weird, right? Because they have that name of a green sea turtle. And they actually don't get that name because of their color. They get it from the food that they eat. So they like to eat algae and seaweed off of the rocks. And then that builds up in their fat. So if you could look inside of a green sea turtle, their fat is green. And that's why they get that name, green sea turtle. So it's not because of its color, which is more of a brown, like a really nice brown color. They get that name from the food that they eat and what it does to their fat. Grade 6s want to know about the white-tip reef shark. Is it nocturnal? Absolutely. So during the day, they kind of sit under those rocks. You saw that I found those two sitting under that rock ledge. Actually, there are 3 in that little video clip. So they're nocturnal. That doesn't mean they don't move around a little bit during the day if they're disturbed, or they might move to a different location, but they come at night and then they like to hunt at night. And then again, they're not a scary shark. They have more like grinding plates for teeth. And so they eat a lot of things off of the bottom, things with hard shells. Definitely not a threat to humans. In fact, the vast majority of sharks are not a threat to humans. I've been lucky enough to dive with sharks all in different places around the world. Hammerhead sharks and bull sharks and Caribbean reef sharks. And never once have I ever felt threatened by a shark. For the most part, they look at it as a human as some weird thing in the water and usually swim away. You're lucky if they stick around and you get to get a couple cool pictures or maybe a little bit of video. So those white tip reef sharks, definitely nocturnal, maybe move a little bit during the day. Another special thing is sometimes you hear people say sharks, if they stop moving, they'll die. And that's true for some species of sharks. Some species have something called ram ventilation, which means they have to swim to force water over their gills. So think of your great whites, your tiger sharks. They kind of have to move through the water. But then there's other ones that have, they call it a buccal pump. And so they can just sit on the bottom and they can pump water themselves. And the nurse sharks, the white tip reef sharks, those are great examples of sharks that can kind of just sit on the bottom and still pump water over their gills. They don't have to keep moving. All right. Well, we are at wrap-up time. So again, I apologize for the change, but with the current political climate in China, we had to postpone Paul's event. So hopefully in the next couple of weeks, I will send a new date out to everybody and we'll connect with Paul, because we've been connecting with Paul on his Out of Eden walk for more than 5 years now. We've connected with him in different parts of Europe and Asia. We've connected with him in India and Myanmar. And then we're really looking forward to catching up on his walk through China so far. So hopefully in a couple weeks. One more question here just popped in the chat about volcanic activity. Absolutely. That hotspot is still active. So there is still new volcanic activity. And that conveyor belt still works. So those islands are still slowly moving towards the east. And as they move towards the east, they move away from the hotspot, which means that the volcanoes stop erupting. And then it means that the forces of nature and weather act on them and they erode the island away until it sinks back beneath the surface again. And then maybe I'll check online really quickly here. Wolf Volcano just erupted not too long ago. Let me see when that was. And that's on Isabella. Let's see when it last erupted. It last erupted, January 7th. So this year, January 7th, 2022. If you go online onto YouTube and search Wolf Volcano erupting, you can see where some of the ships were sitting on the shore and watching the lava come off and into the water. So you can actually see some really cool videos of those eruptions. So definitely still volcanic activity, but it's all in the west where the young islands are. All right. Well, camera classrooms, our 5th graders, our 6th graders, thanks so much for hanging out today. To those who are tuning in via YouTube, thanks for sending in those great questions. Shout out to Paul, wherever he is in China right now. And we will connect with him in about 2 or so weeks. I will reach out to all the classrooms who are registered, and we will make that new date happen, and we'll catch up on the Out of Eden walk. For now, have a great rest of the week, and we will see you in a future event. Thanks, everyone.